truck base, you'll win the race.
You're listening to Trucking Tomorrow, your go-to podcast for exploring and understanding the future of trucking from a carrier's perspective. In each episode, we sit down with industry veterans to discuss what it takes to grow your trucking company in today's world. So let's hit the road with Trucking Tomorrow. Here's your host, Brian Jones.
Welcome to Trucking Tomorrow, presented by TruckBase, where we tell the stories of industry leaders and talk about everything upcoming in the trucking world, from operations to technology to policy. I'm your host, Brian Jones, and I'm grateful to be joined today by Ryan Holland, the founder of 2PL Advisors, which is a transportation advisory company that helps shippers select and partner directly with carriers. Ryan, welcome, and thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks very much. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Excited to chat here. I know 2PL is a bit of a unique beast. We'd love to just hear your story. Can you tell me a little bit about 2PL and what you guys do?
Yeah, absolutely. The model is certainly a little more unique. We position ourselves as a transportation advisory company. We're working generally with the mid to larger size shippers out there, and really from an advisory standpoint, looking at what they're doing, whether that's LTL, PTL, or full truckload, and helping to bring in the right asset-based providers directly into their network, but without any fees to them or brokerage, anything like that. The term 3PL is pretty big right now, and obviously 2PL is a slightly smaller acronym, and that really just has to do with the relationship directly between a shipper and a carrier, which is really what we're trying to foster with our relationships.
Interesting. How is that different than brokerage? Because you guys are still involved, not quite a middleman there, right? But you are involved in the process. We'd love to hear just how you guys are distinct from a brokerage in that regard.
Yeah, we're more of a matchmaker. A broker is generally going to be in between every single transaction. They're going to get invoiced by carriers, they're going to put a margin on it, and they're going to invoice the shippers, right? There is none of that in between what we're doing. Our shippers are getting invoiced directly by the carriers, and they're working with them the exact same way they'd work with anybody else directly in their network that's an asset carrier. And we're really just putting the pieces in place and looking at what they're doing and knowing who the solid carriers are within those lanes or regions or whatever area that we may be focusing, and helping to bring them in directly to create that relationship so they can work directly on all day-to-day matters. They're going to work directly on tendering, dispatch, load tracing, accounting, invoicing, everything like that. We're not involved in the day-to-day there. We're really more of like a national account manager, if you will, getting in the high-ticket items, rate negotiations, things like that to maintain the relationship and make sure that what we said we were going to do and what we implemented for them is really happening.
Got it. That makes sense. I'm curious for shippers that can work directly with carriers on their own or go the brokerage route. What's the value to the shipper, and why do they choose to work with 2PL compared to kind of going alone, if that makes sense?
Yes. So in the truckload market, I mean, there's thousands and thousands of carriers out there, and we certainly don't work with them all. And don't get me wrong, there certainly is a market and a place for brokers. I mean, it's a huge space right now. We're not like anti-broker for any means, but there certainly is a place and a value for bringing in carriers directly too. I'd say it's been less so lately, just because the pricing has dictated that there's a lot of really small carriers out there that may not be able to work directly with the shippers that are working with brokers more so out of necessity, and those rates have been historically lower over the last 2 years. But for the shippers that see the long-term value, because what we're in right now is certainly not going to last forever. These things change pretty quickly, as we've seen from a very, you know, hard market to a very soft market now. That didn't take very long to do. And what you get when you're partnering with really good asset carriers is consistency. You know, you're going to get the rate consistency, you're going to get the service consistency, as long as they're a very good carrier. Drop trailers if they need. It's really knowing who you have on certain lanes or regions that you can count on and trust to be there every single day, because you know the people that are operating those trucks. Compared into a broken relationship, you don't necessarily know who's going to show up that day. Unless they have some carrier contracted there, which you should probably be doing yourself anyway at that point. You're not going to know who that is, and you're really relying on the broker to vet those out and make sure that everything is how it's supposed to be with gets into the double brokering as well. Like you don't hear about that a lot when you're utilizing an asset-based carrier directly. You only hear about that in the brokerage world today. So that's not an issue at all that we encounter.
Interesting. You mentioned a lot of value of going direct with carriers. When you're trying to work with shippers, what are the main things that they're looking for by going direct? Is there any key value points of consistency or I don't know, decreased fraud or other services they're looking for by going direct versus the more brokered model?
Yeah, I mean all those things. Consistency of pricing. When if they're the ones that are giving you a contractual rate and they're the ones that are actually operating those trucks and it's not, brokered purchase power, they can put those rates in place. And we need it held for 6 months to a year. They have the ability to do that because they're the ones that are operating those trucks. The service that we're talking about, as long as they are a good reputable carrier, we should see the same consistency and service on the same lanes. Again, we're putting them on more consistent contractual freight. Yeah, the theft that you talk about, can that still happen? Absolutely, because carriers can't always control the outside factors of somebody literally just coming in and stealing stuff out of their trailer or taking a trailer. I mean, that can happen, but the double brokering that we talked about is not so much a thing. We're working directly with asset-based carriers because, especially right now, they need to be hauling that freight and have consistency on their side too.
Makes sense. Curious on the carrier side where you come in because you're not quite a broker, but you are a matchmaker in some ways. Where do you add value to carriers, and how should they think about 2PL and what services you provide there?
Really, on the carrier side, we're there to open doors that they are not already in. For the fleets that we work with, we're not working with the companies out there that have thousands and thousands of trailers. There's not a big need for us. They have a big sales presence. Everybody knows they are. You see their trucks on the road. We're more focused on that small to mid-size fleet range that they don't necessarily have the resources. Maybe they don't have salespeople or business development people that are constantly working with shippers to get in those doors. And if you're not doing that, it doesn't usually just show up on your doorstep. It takes some effort to do that. So we're opening those doors for them by relationships that we either already have or continuing to create with the shippers that we work with. That once we find an area that is a mutual beneficial match between the shipper and the carrier, we can then bring them in. And then really we've just brought them a new customer. We're helping them to develop that relationship. We want them to work together well. We want them to win the business. We want them to be a long-term customer for them as well. So we're opening those doors. That's really what we're doing on the carrier side, is bringing them things that they do not already have that is a good fit for whatever their business is.
I'm curious if you could share a little bit about what those mutual matches might look like. I could see regional, maybe there's freight type. What does that look like? What's the range of things when you're matchmaking between the shipper and the carrier?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's probably lane driven. Is it an area that you're consistently going or coming back from, that you need freight in, and it's an area that you focus on? I mean, that's probably going to be the biggest factor. Once you get further than that, it gets a little more detailed into, all right, are you a specialized carrier with high value electronics or goods, or things that are much more niche? Then that's obviously easier to locate, but those are not as common as just we're looking at areas, we're looking at lanes, and finding things that a shipper wants to have an asset carrier on a certain area of business, and do we have those carriers that we can then establish the credibility immediately for them? Because when a shipper is entertaining a new carrier, and in the truckload world there's so many, and there's only so many ways to know if they're going to be good without actually trying them. Often in case you don't really know, and too often in a bid cycle you're just looking at a number on a page, and are they the lowest or top five? Let's give them a shot, not knowing if they're any good or not. That's where we can come into them and say, hey, we already work with this company in this in your area with X, Y, and Z shippers as well, and they do a very good job for them. So now we just created credibility from an outside source saying you should feel comfortable working together. Now, if I was just the carrier saying that, of course I'm going to say that. Everybody's going to say that to try to get the business, but from an outside perspective, they're taking our recommendation to heart because we have likely done some things for them already, and we can establish that credibility so they can feel comfortable taking the leap, bringing them on board into their network, and knowing that they can do what we're saying they do because of our experience with them already.
Got it. That makes sense. You brought up the evaluating top 5 bids. When you're going through that and on your end, or as you're looking at shippers evaluating that, are they choosing the lowest price option typically, or are there other factors at play? What might those factors be in evaluating those partnerships?
That is definitely a variable answer, and it all depends on the shipper that you're talking to. I mean, there's certainly some out there that they've got so much top-down pressure where they have to just go with the lowest cost, which is often why you're finding a lot of, brokerage opportunities right now, because if you just look at, DAT and things like that, it is cheaper. It is certainly cheaper to go that route. But not every shipper relies on that, where they can see, the long term and have been through cycles and know that things change, and pretty soon that will flip flop, and the contract rates on asset side will be pretty close to what the spot brokerage rates are. So you get some shippers as well that are willing to see past that and invest in the relationships that they know they are going to need in 3, 6 months, a year, 2 years from now. We don't know necessarily when exactly what it's going to be. We just know that it will happen. But there's other things that go along with that as well, depending on the shipper. We mentioned the high value, electronics. Those kind of companies are willing to, look at other factors besides price, because they know that their transportation spend may be large, but from a percentage of goods perspective, it's very small for them. And what's much more important is the value of the goods going, or is it retail deliveries? Can those carriers, they have access to portals? Can they schedule on time? Can they deliver on time? Because the chargeback penalties for not doing that far outweigh what transportation expense is. And if we're working with shippers that understand that and know, really what hard dollar costs and soft dollar costs are and where they should make that investment, then yeah, price isn't necessarily the number one factor. It's always going to be a factor, but if it's within the range of, what they're willing to do, then yeah, we see other factors that come into play there.
Got it. Makes sense. At the end of the day, it's whether the transportation division is just a cost center, or is it more of a strategic asset for the shipper, right? It's how do you think about transportation? And it's hard to know what one shipper is thinking about versus another.
Sure.
Yeah. I'm curious, when you work with the carrier side, a lot of folks that in our world that are kind of the smaller carriers are moving away from brokered freight or trying to get more direct contracted freight. And one thing they run into is just managing their back solicitation, right? It's a huge thing. You don't want to back solicit anyone. And so I'm curious how you guys navigate that with the carriers that you work with, and kind of clearing that out up front before you get too far in the process, or how you think about that at 2PL.
Well, as it pertains to us in particular, I mean, but back solicitation isn't really a thing because they're already walking through the front door. There is no back door that they have to take because we brought them into that relationship, and, they're already working together, so they can't like more so work together if we've brought them to the table. So that's not really a thing on our side. Obviously, there's some agreements in place that we have with carriers that protects both of us, and we have those, but the back solicitation is not really a key factor for us because we're not trying to hide anything. There's transparency everywhere with what we're doing. Often with brokers, there's certainly a wall in between. The shipper is my customer, you are the carrier. You don't talk. You talk to me, I'll talk to him. You'll talk to me, I'll talk to him. We're removing that barrier so they can talk with each other because we just find it to be more beneficial for how we operate. So that's not a thing for us.
Got it. And if they're running the same lane, right? Because you mentioned about matching, right? The carriers that are running a lane and the shippers that need, a carrier on that lane. Do you ever run into issues where that carrier has actually run for that shipper previously through a brokered load? Or is that just less common given how these contracts are typically funneled towards carriers directly?
Yeah, we've come across that because I mean, there's some shippers that are so large where they have so many brokerages out there that at some point that carrier probably ran some loads within that. We don't see that as a hindrance because our relationship is the shipper just the same way if we were another broker working with that shipper, would we
Mhm.
not give it to the carrier? Would they not take it because they were working with another broker? Very unlikely, because they didn't have the relationship in there. But now, since we are bringing that into the carrier, it's almost helpful for them. We're not targeting these shippers because somebody already works with them through a broker, but there's certainly instances where, yeah, we have a relationship with a shipper. They're telling us they want asset carriers. We go to somebody, they're like, actually, yeah, we've run some loads indirectly. We already know this is a good fit for us, and there it is. And now they control their own destiny on that as well. And they didn't back solicit anybody. We came to them just the same way if we were anybody else, a broker or the shipper, and saying, hey, we want to work with you on something like this.
Awesome. Cool. Because it's more inbound. You're kind of clear from those potential restrictions in those other agreements.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, other than working with someone like 2PL, I'm curious if you have any advice for small to mid-sized carriers that are trying to build up more of their direct volume. What would you advise them to start with? Say they have 95% of their volume is brokered. They're looking to break into that. What steps might a carrier take to move in that direction?
Yeah, it's not easy, because you're accustomed to doing something a certain way, and it is going to be a fundamental change. But there are a couple things. One, you're going to need to have some kind of sales presence there, because, like I said, they don't just kind of show up on your doorstep and say, "Hey, we want to work with you." Because there's thousands of companies out there. You really need to make yourself known and have some kind of sales presence to get you into the door to some of these companies. Now, that's only so good if the second part comes to with your operations. You really need to have a focus on what you do and what you do well. I mean, right now, if you're just taking anything off the spot board to go anywhere and find another load to get back, and it doesn't really matter, it's going to be very difficult to put yourself on contract lanes if you're just not used to doing anything like that and seeing consistency. So you kind of have to move yourself into, okay, what works best for us? What are the lanes that we want to really target? We should probably start focusing on that right now, maybe indirectly through brokerage, until we can find shippers in that lanes that we know that we can then easily transition that over to as well. So that would be probably the from an operational perspective what you need to look at, because if you're not doing that and you're in some of these bidding processes, and we get down to carrier calls and implementation, and you're not even close to running anything remotely close to that, they're going to have some hesitations.
Mm, that makes sense. On the operations side, we obviously talk a lot with carriers around what they're doing to increase their on-time performance, managing their efficiency, all of these questions that are more kind of internal focused. But I'm curious, from where you sit, what differentiates a successful carrier navigating this landscape versus ones that maybe struggle little bit with the transition when they move to more direct freight.
Yeah, there definitely is a factor there. And when you're working with some of the larger shippers, they're going to expect you to be able to integrate with them. And if you were probably broker heavy, they've definitely taken some of that burden off of you, because they're the ones that are integrated and they don't necessarily have to have you. They can manually push those things through, whether that's EDI, API, Four Kites, Project 44, any of the technology out there. You're going to have to be able to work with some of those, especially within your TMS, to be able to communicate all those milestones that they're looking for, pickups and deliveries and appointments and in transit and things like that. And the second part of that probably goes to the question you just had before is, how do I start to transition over to contract freight, is on the appointment side, on the delivery as well. Likely right now, if you're getting you're getting that information, okay, you have an appointment on this day at this time, just show up at that. Well, if you're moving over to the contract shipper side of things, some of them will do that, but I'd say most of the time they're going to, when you get a tender, you're going to need to reach out to whoever that is, if it is appointment rate, and schedule that. Some of those can be very easy, and some of those can be a little complex once you go into big box retailers like Best Buy and Walmart and Target and Amazon. You're going to need to be familiar with their systems to be able to schedule things appropriately for the POs, for the amount of piece count, whatever the requirements may be, or else you're going to fail on that. So you need to have that set up before you commit to any kind of lanes that require it.
Yeah. How does a carrier learn about that? Because I imagine some of that may be described in a contract about how you're going to work together and some of the requirements on updates and the technology and everything there. But I also imagine some of it is, just knowledge of working together and who you reach out to. So how might a carrier develop that knowledge internally for a given shipper?
Yeah, hopefully, if you're working with a great shipper, they're going to tell you this stuff up front, and it's in their best interest because if they bring you on and you're not ready for that, and you start tendering them freight, not only does the carrier fail, but again, we talked about the chargebacks on the retail deliveries. It just costs them a lot more money than whatever those loads just cost as well. So during the onboarding process, that should be a point that's brought up and some outlets to go to be able to set it up. It's not that difficult to go out and set up those accounts to make sure that you can log into portals and schedule things. It just that might be a change within the organization to know that this is what needs to be done, especially before you go pick something up. And again, that usually means communication within your TMS and sending the EDI confirmation for the delivery appointment before you get the pickup appointment. Those are usually requirements in there, and then you go pick up the freight.
Yeah.
So all those SOPs, yeah, some of it's learned, but this should all be, part of the process of getting onboarded onto a shipper as well. Again, not everything is like this. Not everybody has, complicated delivery appointments, but there certainly is some of it out there. And you think about who are really big shippers, where are they going to? You do find a lot of that.
Absolutely. And I imagine it varies if you're delivering for Target or working directly with Target or a local manufacturer where you take all of their volume and they're a relatively small player, right? So
Yeah.
different organizations.
Some of them might just be show up and drop a trailer and hook and you're on your way. And that's it. Could be that simple, but it could be on the other side as well.
You mentioned trailers a couple times. I'm curious how managing a trailer pool and being able to drop trailers at various shippers. How big of a factor is that typically in winning some of these bids?
Yeah, so that can definitely be a huge advantage to the asset carriers because they obviously are going to have that and hopefully have a capability to have some kind of trailer pool. And for the right shippers, some of them are going to require that as well, which already limits now the market for them that they can work with. So that is an advantageous to the carriers that can do that. But some of them, you know, won't allow it at all because they want piece count or live loading or things like that. But it can be an asset to the asset carriers, no pun intended there, to be able to have that capability to drop on either the shipper or the receiver side there.
Got it. Makes sense. Um, we talked about EDI and connectivity a few times, but one thing we see a lot in the smaller carriers is what's the minimum level of technology and management you need in place to start to do these things, right? What metrics are you tracking and consistently delivering on? What systems do you have? If you're living off spreadsheets versus have a TMS, at least, I imagine those are two different things. So I'm curious if there's a minimum level of systems that you generally see before this even becomes a possibility for a smaller carrier.
Yeah, I mean, at the bare minimum, you need to have some kind of TMS and ideally some kind of connectivity, whether that's EDI or API, just because it's becoming a requirement, if you're going to be communicating, or it's not always a requirement, but if you're going to start doing this at a high level, it's going to be very difficult to manage that through a manual process because let's say you can't do that in the beginning until you get your EDI set up. That means you're going to have to log into the shipper's TMS and go through all these milestones. And there's usually a timing requirement of when it needs to complete it by. Okay, within the hour, you need to go through and check off delivery. And if you didn't do that, then you're outside of compliance and your scorecard goes down. So the more you can get on the system side, just so the easier it is going to be. There's obviously a investment in learning and implementation to be able to do all that. But once you have it set in place, you're now limitless on who you can work with and communicate with via technology. So it kind of has to be there in order to be working with more and more of these shippers.
Yeah. You mentioned the scorecard there, so would love to hear about that because a lot of our carriers are trying to figure out how they optimize their performance so they go to the top of the list when the next bid comes around. Hey, this is a great carrier. We want to give them more volume. What types of things should should small to mid-sized carriers be tracking to kind of really optimize their scorecard for some of these major shippers?
So if you did the hard part and you got in the door, how do you stay inside? And
And get more.
it's servicing, yeah, and getting more, because you likely, if it's your first shot, you didn't get everything, you got tested out. How do you grow? How do you do better within the shipper? And it's going to be the scorecarding. It really comes down to service. There's a couple KPIs that shippers are more likely to track. That's going to be tender acceptance, which right now is probably not going to be a big deal. You're hopefully willing to accept everything that you're getting, but sometimes that becomes an issue if you're prime on something. They're expecting you to take it. That comes with that consistency, and there's usually a high threshold for that. 96, 98, sometimes 100% acceptance on tenders.
Mhm.
Obviously, the on-time performance is going to be a big one. Are you delivering to the appointment? And that's going to vary on the thresholds that a shipper puts in place. Can you be late to a certain amount of hours? Can you be early to a certain amount of hours? Is it to the day? You need to make sure that you're looking at that and then making sure you're, hitting the milestones properly. Again, if you're on the manual thing and it delivered at the correct time, but you didn't enter in the correct time because you waited too long, that data flows into the scorecard, and then either it looks bad or you have to go back and correct it. And nobody wants to do that. Outside of that, I mean, those are the two biggest factors, right? On time delivery, pickup, tender acceptance is, you know, b- obviously theft is not going to be a good thing to a certain extent, that it's out of your control. But those are going to be the two main factors that everybody's going to look at. And if you have those numbers high, all your other milestones are high with tracking every so often and things like that, then there's no reason they should take you out of the network. They were more likely to work with you to see what they can do to, grow it, keep you in the network, and give you more, if you're doing a good job.
Awesome. Well, I know a lot of what you do at 2PL is bridging a knowledge gap and a connectivity gap, right, across different stakeholders. I'm curious what you have done, Ryan, and how you built up this expertise over time. Where did you learn all of this world? Right, there's a lot of pieces to this, and there's no book you can read to learn all of it, right? So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you kind of came into this world of 2PL and where you learned this.
Yeah, I mean, I first started at of course, 3PL, the other three-letter acronym there, and not even in the truckload space, mostly in the parcel and LTL space, and that's where I kind of learned the industry just by being there. And then I saw a different model I didn't think anybody was doing. Turns out there are a couple companies that work similar to us now, but at the time I didn't know, and I was like, I really want to pursue this and be able to work with one larger shippers, and I want to bring in direct relationships, and I want to see how I can, make this work. And that's really, it actually came down to one customer that, we brought in a carrier. It was a truckload customer, but it was all getting brokered, and this brokerage had never really done truckload before, and there was all kinds of everything worked from an operational standpoint because I had them working together from tendering and dispatching and things like that. But when it came down to invoicing, brokerage couldn't handle what the needs were of the shipper with the multi-stop PODs and things like that, where it just wasn't going to work out. And that was kind of my light bulb moment of, well, what if I just brought these two companies together and work together, and then I'll work with the carrier from a sales perspective. And that's really how the company started. But ever since then, over the last 9, 10 years, it's just been learning by experience. And that's not a great answer because you have to do it to figure it out. But if you're working with companies or individuals that have been through that, they can, save you all that time and effort and failure to get to where you need to be.
Well, I guess looking forward to the future because we are on trucking tomorrow here. Would love to hear what's on the horizon for 2PL in the future, and what your maybe goals or priorities are for the next year to 5 years.
Yeah. I mean, we've grown every year since we started substantially, and we're looking to continue that trend and continue to develop really solid relationships with our shippers and our carriers, so that as the right fits come along, we can easily put them together. And it's really just keeping that going, for as much and as long as possible. That's really the main goal for our side.
Awesome. I always love asking folks the crystal ball question.
Yeah.
What do you see in the market happening in the next year? Obviously, you see a certain segment of the market, but talking about carriers and shippers, what should they be looking out for in the next 12 months or so?
Right. So anytime you see anything in transportation, they're talking to each other like we are, or news articles, that question always comes up, and someone already has an answer, even though they don't actually know, and I don't actually know either. But we're all really guessing, and my guess is it's definitely going to change. It's just a matter of when. I think that's the same answer for everybody. Um, can it happen in 2024? I think it can. It certainly isn't going to happen. I don't think in the near term, but towards the end of the year, as we gear up again for holiday season, I think that will likely be the telltale sign. And obviously, election and stuff like that. You know, I'm certainly no economist, but that's what you're supposed to say during an election year, that it can factor into these things. But we don't know. All I know is it's very difficult out there right now from a truckload market perspective, and we're already seeing capacity come out of the market, and it's going to continue coming out of the market until things get to a level where you can operate at a profitable level. You can only last so long operating unprofitably until you just run out of money and you got to park the trucks. You see too often, because you can see it in bids and charge the amount that brokers or carriers are charging, and based on cost of running, that is a loss, and how long can you sustain that? And it's a tough position to be in. I certainly feel for them, but eventually supply and demand works itself out, and enough supply comes out of the market. And if demand takes up or stays the same, then that's when you see the rates start to come to a level where I think it'll be much more equitable for shippers and carriers to work together again, the same way we did probably back in 2018, 2019, things like that, where it was more of a toss up of who you wanted to work with, and the pricing was pretty similar, and where you wanted to put your value on your relationships and who you wanted to have hauling your freight. We will get back to that point. It's just, when does it happen?
It's a cycle
No,
that repeats itself a few times over here.
always does.
Um, well, talk about that crystal ball. Kind of one of my last questions for you here is, how do you stay smart and connected? Obviously, you have a lot of perspectives you get through just the work you do. But I always like to ask folks, for our carrier partners, especially that might be listening, they want to educate themselves. What's happening in the market? What's changing? And I'm curious, Ryan, what do you do to educate yourself and keeping a pulse on the market and in the future of kind of trucking and logistics more generally?
From my side, it's really just conversations with everybody that we work with. Not only with the shippers and the carriers, which are obviously the two biggest drivers in everything of what they're seeing, but other companies out there that are outside of that, TMS providers or other technology providers, and what they're seeing, and any of the publications out there. We're always looking at that to get an understanding of what's going on, and hopefully what we can expect. But it's really just the conversation that we're having with shippers, especially the ones that have very large spends, and they can get a feel for what's going on as well when they're running some of their procurement events. And then the carriers are the first ones to see it also, especially the ones on the brokerage side, is the spot market and what it's doing in certain lanes, and you start to see some hot areas start to pick up again, and some areas stay the same, and they know that, they can see it, and they see the rates come through every single day, and they'll tell us. They know where it's at.
Awesome. Last question is, if any carriers or shippers are interested in 2PL, want to learn more, interested in your services, how should they reach out or try to connect here?
Yeah, they can reach out to our info at 2pladvisors.com. We have another person, Jennifer, on our team, who handles all the relationships with our carriers on the truckload side, as well as those shippers, and she'd be the one to have a conversation with and talk about more detail of what we could do for them. And similarly on the shipper side as well, we'll get to some other people that are more on the shipper side too, on our team.
Awesome. Cool. Well, Ryan, thanks for coming on the show. It's great to have you. Appreciate taking the time here today.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Trucking Tomorrow, The show notes include links to any resources mentioned in today's show. And if you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe so you never miss an episode and leave us a 5-star review.
With truck base, you're always tough.